Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these lectures. Our lecture today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. These brown bags are supported by your membership in the Preservation Association of Lincoln. We encourage you to join to support these activities. You can go online to preservelincoln.org to join. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. He has served on the City of Lincoln Preservation Commission for more than 2 decades, and he's currently on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees. Jim's talk today is titled Lincoln's Haymarket. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Thank you, Arlene. I think we want to start with the fact that there is not historically a Haymarket in Lincoln. It's kind of a misnomer, a word that came up as the wholesale district changed its character and as the wholesale grocers, as we will see, left the area and left it by the 80s almost empty. Then Russell Stover's left, and at that point in time, Dale Gibbs had a class at the University of Nebraska, and he said that they came up with the idea of the Haymarket. And it sounds better if you're going to have an entertainment and food-related area to say we're going to the Haymarket than we're going to the wholesale district, which is really what it had developed into. Then Keith Royer came along, and he was in advertising and consulting and sort of picked up the word moniker, the moniker Haymarket, I should say. But when we look back historically, Lincoln is one of the cities that, although it had a Haymarket, it was never called the Haymarket. Originally, the block, which was between 9th and 10th O and P Street, was given to the city of Lincoln by the state of Nebraska in 1867 for use as a market square, which we might define as a Haymarket. Actually, in fact, what it was virtually a glorified parking lot. It was that area where if you were traveling through in a wagon, for example, you probably would have camped there overnight. And after that, it became sort of a spot where as people camped there also were land sharks and gamblers preyed on those people. And cutting across that area, almost diagonally along the edge of it, towards the northwest edge, was a trail which came from Nebraska City by Nursery Hill, which today we would call Syracuse, through Lincoln, and off towards the Salt Flats, so you would have seen that. But the market square was virtually a place where people parked. Then along came the federal government, and after having a post office in Lincoln located in a cabin and in storefronts, the postal facility decided that we should have a proper U.S. Post Office, federal courthouse, and U.S. Customs House. What they thought we needed a customs house for, as landlocked as we are, I don't know, but we should have one. The federal government fell in love with that same square block and asked permission to buy it from the city of Lincoln. How about that? The federal government asking permission to buy from the city of Lincoln. The city of Lincoln wanted a post office very badly, a proper post office, but they discovered that that land had been given to them by the state of Nebraska, by the Capital Commission specifically. And so they had to go to the legislature and ask for permission to sell that block of land. They obtained permission from the state of Nebraska to sell the block of land known as Market Square only if they replaced it with another square block of land which would be used as a market square. And now Market Square, what they were really talking about was probably closer to what we would call the farmer's market today, where farmers would bring in produce. And of course they would use it as a parking lot as well. Because when farmers came to town, or anyone came to town, if they came with a wagon, by the time you parked very many of those on the city street, you would have taken up all the streets. So they needed to get them off the streets, and it became a parking lot. At that point in time, the city looked around for another square block of land, and they discovered there was one, 2 blocks to the north, which had never been used, an open square block of land, and it was noted by the Capital Commission as the historical block. It was a block to be given to the State Historical Society, which had not formed at that time, could not accept it, so the city just stepped in and took it, literally by adverse possession, which they couldn't do. And later on, they're going to find out when Mr. Furness is head of the State Historical Society, they're going to be forced to go and buy roughly a half a square block of land directly to the east of the Capitol building, which will become the new site for the Nebraska State Historical Society. And they will build a basement and get foundation blocks about 3 to 4 feet off the ground and run out of money. That never happened before, never will happen again, but the legislature at that time, as they do now, gave money in 2-year cycles. And finally, with the basement there and the walls coming up above the ground, the governor said, this is no way to do this. Let's either appropriate enough money to complete the building for which plans had been drawn and architect renderings had been made, or let's not do it. So the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, decided, let's not do it. They brought in crews from the state penitentiary and bulldozed in the walls, and maybe some of that stuff that was in the basement of the Historical Society is still there. We don't know what's there because there's nobody left. The only thing we think might be there is the prow of the battleship Nebraska, which nobody knew what to do with anyway. If it wasn't sold for scrap metal, it may still be buried down there. But at any rate, I drift from the subject. So we did have a new market square, but again, it was not truly a Haymarket square. We're going to look today at a few of the buildings which are there and how what we call today Haymarket Square, how they developed. One of the oldest buildings in the area is the one which still exists. Today it is, as far as I know, an unoccupied restaurant. It has been through the years a number of restaurants. Capital City Grill, I think, was the last one which was there. And my understanding is it is closed at the present time. Somebody's going to step in there, that's for sure. This was built in 1881 by a company called Seaton and Lee, S-E-A-T-O-N, and Lee, L-E-A. They came from Atchison, Kansas, and established here a branch. Built the 3-story building on the corner, which we see here in an 1882 line drawing. It's on the northwest corner of 8th and Q Streets. You may recognize it as the building which has a caboose behind it, which is attached to the building and used as a adjunct to their restaurant. The original building, the 3-story building, was called a foundry and oven. However, as soon as they started building around it, it became the blacksmith shop, the boiler shop, which were built to the north, and this became the pattern shop. By 1882, they said that using this little compound of buildings that they had about 20 to 30 men in their employment. Then, unexplainedly, although even in 1886 they showed that they were doing great things and had great sales, in 1887 they just simply closed. Went back to Atchison, Kansas, and this became the Armour, A-R-M-O-U-R, Armour Cudahy building, so it was meat, if you will. Later on, it's going to become the Carter Transfer, Globe Laundry, Sullivan Transfer, and they again will use all of the buildings in the area right there. Little building to the left, the Hide and Fur building, which is still there too, becomes part of this complex. When La Paloma, the restaurant, which headquartered out of Havelock originally, took it over, they're the ones that brought the caboose in and set it on rails. There would have been a spur service through there originally, and we can still see sort of remnants, if you will, of the spur in the caboose. And then if you go across the street to the south, you can see some new railroad tracks set in the brick there where it went into the Granger Brothers Milady Coffee building. It became the Brazen Head, and those folks brought in a complete interior of a bar from Ireland, set it in there, called the Brazen Head. Changed hands a number of times, became Bechamel, and then finally the Capital City Grill. The building is very interesting. It is made out of brick, which is very soft kiln brick, probably fired not in a kiln, possibly built or burned brick, we would call it, where they set a rick of wood on the ground, as hard a wood as they can find. Then they put the green bricks on it, stack more brick around it, and then ultimately set it on fire, and this sets the brick. Now, whether this is how this brick was made or not, we can't be sure, but it's a very soft brick, and the brick itself is so friable that I urge you that if you do go up to the building, don't be messing around with that brick. It's pretty soft. And through the years, we've seen people put signs on the building, drilling holes in both the masonry and the brick, and have a great time trying to keep that building intact. The windowsills are the thing which you might want to look at. If you've got a magnet in your pocket, you'll discover that they're magnetic. They're metal, iron, and so interestingly, you can actually touch a magnet to them and they will stick. Ed and I used that for one of the clues in our history mystery one time. On the corner directly to the east of that was the Metropolitan Hotel, kind of a nifty little building, the mansard roof on the northwest corner of 8th and O Streets. This was owned by a man by the name of S.F. Downing and was built probably 1870, 1871. It's always difficult to look back and tell specifically when a building was built if it didn't get reported in the newspaper, because of course the city of Lincoln had no building permits at that point in time. But we do know that by 1889, this building is gone, a cute little building. And also it's interesting, one of those buildings I like to talk about, because if you look in the city directories, you find this building moves around in the area. It moves from the northwest corner to the northeast corner to up a ways on O Street. And all this points out is that don't trust city directories, because they can be very elusive. But a nifty little building. The building next door to the left is the Buckstaff Brothers building. This was their Lincoln Saddlery building. The address would be 736 O Street. J.A. Buckstaff, who was the primary in the firm, came from Wisconsin in 1869, so the city of Lincoln would have been only 2 years old when he came. The Buckstaff Brothers, as they became known, owned a vast array of businesses in the city of Lincoln. They owned the Vitrified Paving and Pressed Brick Company, so they were actually burning bricks or kilning bricks. The Badger Lumber Company, and of course you can see Badger comes from their Wisconsin ties. The Lincoln Paper Manufacturing Company. Now the Lincoln Paper Manufacturing Company was located just off of Salt Creek at about Calvert Street, just a little east of Calvert. And if you go to First and Calvert, which is where the entrance to Epworth Park is, and go directly to the east, you will find remnants of a bridge crossing Salt Creek there. They were probably somewhere in this general area because paper manufacturing turns out a lot of dirty water, and they would have wanted to dump it someplace, probably into the creek right there, which would have been directly east of a 1-mile horse race track, which belonged to the grounds which preceded Epworth Park. They've turned out an interesting piece of paper, probably brown paper, probably a very coarse wrapping paper. It was 72 inches wide, and they said they produced 130,000 yards of paper a day, or 90 yards per minute while they were operating. They also said that they used, in the manufacture of paper, 5 tons of straw per year. So that's what leads me to believe it was a very coarse, heavy paper. In addition to that, they owned the Lincoln Saddlery Company, the Wisconsin Furniture and Coffin Company, which was located down at about 4th, 5th, and MN in that area. A very large frame building, long gone. And Stout and Buckstaff Paving Contractors. They had interest in other firms as well. This particular building, which I'm sure some of you remember, was simply for saddles, horse blankets, and bridles. They had 50 employees working in and out of this building, including 3 men who traveled on the road. They claimed to have $50,000 worth of stock in this building at all times of harness, blankets, and saddles, which at those prices was a whole heck of a lot of saddles. The building is gone today. Part of it still exists. Right here, if you go down and look at the building, one of the things which was left, I can't be sure if this was one of the things we asked for in the Historic Preservation Commission or not, but we got it at any rate, is a sort of a remnant of what the building was, and you can find it. That was the Lincoln Hotel in the background back there. And you can see it attached to that building. And part of that is a cast iron front, probably manufactured by Seton & Lee in Lincoln. And of course, now you can see where the Metropolitan Hotel was to the east or to the right is now the J. Granger Company. And what was the building torn down for? Well, naturally, it was torn down for a parking lot. The railroad is going to change what we call the Haymarket today completely. Now, up until the time the railroad arrives, this would be from 1867 till about 1870, that area would have been filled with very small houses, modest houses, mostly people who worked for the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. There would have been hotels. There were hotels scattered along O Street, clear down to 4th Street. So we're hoping that some of those might someday turn up an archaeological dig. Who knows? Peter Bleed is, I think, aching to look down there beyond the Badger Lumber Company. But they would also have had little businesses like drugstores and small grocery stores. This is what have been all over in that area, small houses. And if we look to the north on 7th and 8th Street, clear into the area around Charleston, we can still see some of those tiny little houses extant, although many of those are in danger of being torn down. Those would have come all the way up to O Street at that point in time. But with the coming of the railroad in 1870, the whole character of this neighborhood will change completely. Now, the first railroad train to pull into what will be the city of Lincoln was pulled by the engine Wahoo. It antedated a train which we hoped would get here on July the 4th of 1870, and would have, however, there were no tracks. That's the only thing that prevented it from getting here. On July 4th of 1870, the Burlington, Missouri, which left Plattsmouth, came up as far as Newton, and maybe right on the edge of what we would call Havelock today. Newton was a little village which never existed but was on the railroad. It had a whistle stop about where the drug company is today. And it went through that area, and it was land developed by originally Mr. R.E. Moore, whose name is on one of the quadrants of Lincoln General Hospital, which we now call Bryan West. If I'm not mistaken, I have to stop and think all the time, but anyway, the old Lincoln General Hospital. R.E. Moore gave the money for roughly 1/3 of the original cost of the hospital when it was over on the adjacent street. And R.E. Moore developed the city of Newton, platted it, put lots up for sale, but never sold a single lot. But at that point, that's where the railroad reached July the 4th of 1870. So they had an excursion train which left Plattsmouth, got up to that point. They took the people off the train, put them on wagons, and brought them into Lincoln for a 4th of July celebration. So it isn't going to be till July the 26th that the engine Wahoo will come into Lincoln. They're laying track at a rapid rate. It's hard to believe that they laid as fast as they were in some places. But they came into Lincoln and got here July the 26th of 1870, pulled by the engine Hurricane. They pulled 2 cars into Lincoln, but it wasn't be railroad service started at that time. They're going to pull in and keep building to the west. And originally, the ground we saw, the railroad wasn't even configured quite the way it is today. So about August 9th, the first actual trains will be coming in and serving the city. And at that point in time, hotels will begin to be built down here. And with hotels, soon we will have businesses which are serving and served by the railroad, in other words, freight. So we'll start having manufacturing and wholesale and distribution coming into the area. By 1873, when this picture is taken, this is Godfrey's elevator. This is the corner of 7th and S Streets. So just think of it as very close to where the arena is going to be built today, maybe just a little bit to the east of there. And we can see a wooden sidewalk on the left-hand side and a hitching post, and we're looking down S Street towards the west. And of course, all these trains crossed at grade. Godfrey's elevator. And as I mentioned, with the hotel came, with the railroad came hotels. There were several scattered along O Street, and there were rooming houses as well as hotels. These existed because of the railroad. And as we go to any new town, we find that when the railroad arrives, that's where the first hotels will be built, close to the railroad. One of the first hotels will be on the northeast corner of 7th and P. Others will be on 4th and O, 5th and O, and as we'll see, 6th and O, 7th and O, and so forth. This hotel, which we would remember as Bennett's Hotel, started as a house, and you can see the house back there, and you can see the sign just vaguely up here on top of the 2nd floor. It says Bennett Hotel. The building actually stopped right there, and what we see, the railroad ticket little building, was actually on the sidewalk. And as we look in the Haymarket today, we find streets like 7th Street just suddenly stopping in the Creamery building. And I have to assume that part of this is because when the city of Lancaster's plat was set, the blocks were smaller and the streets were not as wide. And as the plat of the city of Lincoln overlays the plat of Lancaster, the plat of Lancaster is amazingly never vacated. So we have streets that I think probably partly echo back to the city of Lancaster down there and don't necessarily go anyplace anymore. And that gives us little things like the alley between the Burkholder project and Ivana Cone, which is not an alley. That is private property. It's not a city alley, just for a short distance in there. So we have some very unusual things. But the other thing we have here is people building where there's sidewalk today. And so this railroad ticket agency actually is west of the wall of the present Burlington, what do they call it? Not Fireworks. I think it's Laszlo's again, isn't it? Yeah. So this would be to the west of that brick building on the sidewalk. And at that time, it was possible to lease from the city of Lincoln sidewalk area as well as vaults underneath the sidewalk. There was even a fruit market at 13th and O out on the sidewalk where today Miller and Payne would be. So this is built in almost common ground. Whether they actually leased it from the city or just built it there is hard to say. So the house on the corner is converted to the hotel with the coming of the railroad. And in 1915, that frame building will be torn down and the extant brick building will be built at a cost of $20,000. And of course, it was a railroad hotel. And it existed as a hotel until around 1980. And on the ground floor was, more importantly, Bennett's Hotel Restaurant, or the Café Benet, as we called it. And it was open, literally 24 hours a day. So, originally to serve the railroad, but so as, say you were in a fraternity and you had been out the night before doing what fraternity boys do, and you need something then to put on board which will ameliorate what you have taken on board, well, you could go down there and get something to eat, which would supposedly dissipate the effects of alcohol. Later it became Jabrisco, and this, of course, is Laszlo's and Fireworks and so forth. They're going to redo the building for a while. It will be a vertical shopping center called Haymarket Junction, which doesn't last too long. They will then infill the building next door, which will be Laszlo's. And as we know it today, we'll stand there. Now, the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad, I mentioned, was the first railroad to reach Lincoln in July of 1870. But there were several railroads that were trying to get here first, and the reason they were trying to get here first was the state of Nebraska was eager to have a railroad serve the new capital city of Nebraska. 1867 became the state of Nebraska and the capital. So the state and counties and the city, in order to encourage railroads to come, began offering inducements, including the gift of land, the gift of bond money to build a depot, and so forth. So a lot of people, well, at least 3 railroads we know of, were started primarily hoping to get here first and win those prizes. One of them was the Midland Pacific Railroad. This is pretty optimistic. Midland and Pacific has started out of Nebraska City and actually got bonds from Otoe County to help them build the railroad because, of course, Nebraska City was the old trailhead, and they wanted to maintain that trailhead from the wharfs on the Missouri River towards the west and Fort Kearny and so forth. So it was to their advantage, and they put up, between Lancaster County and Otoe County, $150,000 worth of bonds in addition to the land that they were offered. They began grading towards Lincoln in 1868. In 1869, the legislature offered an extra 100,000 acres of land to induce the first railroad to come here. They just kept sweetening it all the time. Lancaster County will authorize ultimately $50,000 a bond to help construction of a depot. They didn't reach Lincoln until 1871, so some months after the Burlington Railroad arrived, the Midland Pacific arrived. Didn't get much closer to the Pacific than Lincoln, Nebraska. Their depot that we see here was originally located at 5th and H Streets. As the Midland Pacific changes its direction, merges with the Brownville, Fort Kearny, and Pacific Railroad and so forth, and ultimately is absorbed into what we call the Burlington Northern Santa Fe today, the depot building at 5th and H is picked up and physically moved to the southeast corner of 8th and N Streets. And this, I remember sitting there. This sat there and probably wasn't torn down until about 1950, maybe as early as 1949. And it served as an adjunct to the lumberyard, which is located on that corner. And of course, when they rebuild and it becomes Baker Hardware, they will build a concrete block building on the corner. This building will go away. First as part of the lumberyard and then part of Baker Hardware. And if you go into Baker Hardware today, you will notice towards the east, you can see the old wooden wooden lumberyard sheds are still there. They're part of the existing hardware store. So 1950 or so this came down, and some of you may remember it as I do. Now, as the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad and the Union Pacific build across Nebraska, one of the things that they have is, of course, grants of land from the federal government and in other inducements as well. However, you can't build a railroad with assets of land. You have to sell some of that land to get cash to build the railroad, which is very expensive. And many people thought for a long time that the railroads were getting filthy rich off of this, but in fact, most of this land that they sold was simply to keep them going in their building projects. In order to sell that land, they had to advertise it. They offered it for roughly an average of $7 an acre, but it varied a little bit depending on whether it was in good land or poor land and how much water was available and so forth. One of the things they did was to encourage or induce people to come here and look at that land was, if you remember Tuttle Creek Dam, when they built that, they enticed people to come to Tuttle Creek, and they said, if you will come down to Tuttle Creek Dam, we will give you a free Timex watch, we will put you up in the hotel, we will buy you a sumptuous dinner, and all you have to do is listen to our 1-hour taped presentation on buying land at Tuttle Creek. Well, the Burlington was doing the same thing. They put out advertisements all over the United States, even in Germany and in Europe, offering people to come here to look at the land. And they, in order to do that, would say, we'll give you a free railroad pass from wherever, Indiana or whatever, come out to look at the land. They said that, in fact, of the people that they encouraged to come out and look at land and hopefully buy it, almost 50% ultimately did purchase land from the Burlington. And if you live in Lincoln, look at your abstract, if you still have it, and you will find that chances are good you're going to go back far enough to find that land belonged to the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad and has just changed hands many, many times. Now, one of the things they also did was they built at the depot yards a building called the Immigrant House. And the Immigrant House itself was built in the summer of 1871. And it stood probably directly to the west of the current depot someplace. Now, there were no foundations or basements on the land down there, on these buildings, so unfortunately, even Peter Bleed can't find anything left of this building or most of the buildings. One of the problems is, of course, it is in the floodplain, and as you can see there, the sidewalk, and as it turns to the left in dog legs, that sidewalk runs pretty much directly towards the northwest as near as we can tell. And we can see it's built up on stilts. Some of the buildings are built up on stilts. And also, this would flood, of course, when the Salt Creek rose. And not only did Salt Creek rise, but Oak Creek came above its ground, and it merged with Salt Creek at roughly 5th and S Streets. That's originally where the confluence of Oak and Salt Creek was. We've relocated it now so that it's north of the old fairgrounds. But at that time, this area was very, very prone to flooding. And I think Peter said that most of this land came up in depth to its present height. Some of it's been brought up 8, 10, even 12 feet, so that it's better above the floodplain than it was then. But at any rate, he's looked for the building. We can't find it. The Immigrant House is the one on the left with the little dormers on it. The building which you can see with white highlighted windows, it says Eating House. And of course, originally, if you came on a train, there would have been no food service on the train. The train would have stopped every so often. It was stopped around the noon hour, and you would have had 20 minutes to run in and eat and get back on the train and leave. So until dining cars came along, always there was an eating house. So the Immigrant House had another function, however. It also served as part of the inducement to buy land, because the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad said, if you will buy land from us, one of the things we will do is we will go back to your home in, let's say, Indiana or Pennsylvania, and we will give you a freight car in which you can pack your furniture, your family, and your livestock. We will then transport it to the nearest immigrant house. There had been an immigrant house in Omaha. There was another immigrant house on another railroad, for example, at a little further to the east. I can't think of the name of the town, it slipped my mind. But they scattered around. The one in Lincoln was right here. And we will take this property either free or at half price to Lincoln, and you can unload it there. If you bought more expensive land or if you bought a lot of land, you get a free ticket. And although it seems unlikely, people would put their livestock, their furniture, and their families all in this one car in order to move them here. Now, you get here, you would take a day or so to unload the stuff. And in the meantime, you could stay in what was called the Immigrant House. It was a free hotel offered by the railroad. Although it was a free hotel, sort of, the only cost would have been involved if you wanted hot water, and then you had to pay for the coal to heat the water. There were separate bathing facilities and kitchen facilities as well in the building. By June of 1872, in other words, roughly a year from when it was built, they said that 636 women and children had availed themselves of staying overnight in the Immigrant House. 636 women and children. You'll notice there are no men or boys. And my conjecture is, and I think it's a good one, that the men and the boys would have stayed on the railroad car with the furniture and the livestock in order to, to protect it. People could stay a couple of days, but of course the idea was, from their point of view as well as railroads, to get them out of there and move them out onto the land as quickly as possible. And as I said, about half of the people did buy land from the Burlington. So this is the complex, and we only assume, but think, it was directly west, and how far? Maybe a half a block or something to the west of the current building? I'm not sure, but off in the middle of what would be the railroad yard later. This is the second, if you will, Burlington and Missouri River Railroad depot building. The first built in 1870. And this one completed in 1881, so the first one stood just a smidge over a decade. In 1894, we're going to see the first viaduct built over the tracks as well. So shortly after this building is built, we'll see a viaduct constructed, and it will be roughly a block to the south of this building. This roughly sits exactly on the footprint of the present building, pretty close. At this point in time, we were approaching the point in time when the railroad yards will have their heaviest traffic in terms of number of trains. By the 1900 to 1908 era, somewhere in there, this depot was hosting an average of 75 freight trains per day and 25 passenger trains per day. It hit its peak at about 109 total trains a day in about 1908, 1909, something like that. And at that time, there were 42 miles of track within the switching yard. 42 miles of track, and at its height, I counted 37 parallel north-south tracks from the furthest west up to the spur which served the Lincoln Journal, and which they unloaded those huge spools of paper. 37 tracks. So if you can imagine driving up to that little obstacle on O Street and having to conceivably wait for 37 different obstacles to pass over, the viaduct was an absolute necessity. And it's also one of the reasons why Lincoln did not develop west of Salt Creek and the Burlington yards and the other railroad yards, or Salt Creek if you're not from Lincoln. Because of this, and they didn't even bother to plat streets on the other side of First Street because they knew no one would ever settle over there. And for a long time they were right. At the same time, the Burlington arrived in Lincoln, literally the same day. What became the Lincoln Journal-Star, then the Nebraska newspaper, changed from a weekly newspaper to a daily newspaper. They said that now the town was big enough to have a daily newspaper. Statistics are kind of fun, I think. But we know that the two primary railroads that came through Nebraska were the Union Pacific and the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. The Burlington received from the federal government in Nebraska as a grant $2,000,000 374,090 acres of land, the Burlington. From the state of Nebraska, they received 40,105 acres of land. The Union Pacific received a total of 4,800,046,108 acres of land, which means that at its height, at one blink of time, the railroads owned 16.6% of the state of Nebraska, of the real estate. A rather incredible figure. This railroad building cost $125,000 to build, 54 by 182 feet. One of the things that Mr. Tuzlan, whose name remains with us on a street, Mr. Tuzlan, the vice president of the railroad at that time, he sold the concession to the eatery to a couple by the name of the Swans, but they had to agree that they could charge no more than 50 cents for any full meal. And at the same time, they also had to agree that they would furnish that same meal to any Burlington employee for 25 cents. But again, remember that everybody that came through on the train, if they hadn't brought a sack lunch with them, they had to get off the train and eat and get back on the train. So it was a very lucrative operation. One of the interesting things about this building is the third floor, the top floor up there. One half of the top floor of this building was set aside at one point in time to be covered with pallets. And these pallets, in turn, had hundreds of glass jars, rectangular glass jars about 18 inches tall, sitting on them, with just enough room between a solid mass of glass jars so that you could walk down back and forth and fill those glass jars about 1.5 to 2 inches on the top with distilled water to replenish the sulfuric acid that was in them. That half of the top floor of the building was, in fact, a battery. And that battery had enough juice in it to provide 907 miles worth of electricity to operate the telegraph for the Burlington, all the lines west. Incredible. Let's see, I think that may be the second picture. No, this is taken from the viaduct. This picture is a postcard, so probably about the 1908-1909 period. And we can see this would have been at about the highest point of its usage. Now, when I say it's the highest point of its usage, I mean number of trains going through. Because the train at that time could be 3 or 4 cars long. A passenger train was often very short. Today, another interesting statistic, there are more, and this may not be due now, but I think it is still, there are more cars going through the yard than there were then, because they're all full of coal. And of course, the number of passenger trains has dropped from 25 per day to 2, one headed west and one headed east. And in 1909, I always like to remind people, because of the huge number of trains going through here and everything mechanical, you had to be able to set your watch by the trains. The trains had to run absolutely purely on schedule. Today, if you want to catch a train, you can't set your calendar by the trains because Amtrak may be a day late if they're having trouble on the line. So things have changed a lot. The little building just this side of the depot stood well into the life of the new building, and that was an express agency. And on the other side, there was another mirror image of that building. Now this is Market Square. After we have built the post office building at 9th and O Streets, we moved our Market Square function to here. Still not called Haymarket Square. It could have been, but it never was. We're looking towards the university. We can see the tallest building is University Hall or Nebraska Hall, and it stood directly to the west of Sheldon Art Gallery and directly to the east of the library building, Architecture Hall, and so forth, in that grassy area. And its back wall, its north wall, would have impinged upon Ferguson Electrical Engineering. They would have overlapped. But now we don't have Ferguson anymore either. We've torn that down too. So that's the tallest building. Excuse me. On the corner is the city scales. To the right of that will later develop one of the city gasoline stations, and further to the right of that will be City Hall, Fire Department, and County Health Department. But you can see the rest of this block is full of horses and hay. So we could call it Haymarket. In this picture, we're looking towards the northwest, and it looks even more like a Haymarket. And a great percentage of this block at this time was leased to the Woods brothers, who sold hay and imported horses. But it still was not called the Haymarket. Another picture, looking towards the northwest, the building which we can see back there is the Chicago Northwestern Missouri Pacific Railroad Depot, which was located, in general terms, just to the east of the present, what we call the new post office, but which pretty soon is going to be gone, I'm quite sure. So then it'll be the old post office, and we'll all nostalgically remember that building. Maybe not. And of course, when I was a kid, that building over to the right over there was still there, and it was what? Right across the street from the police department, fire department, county health, and they had a city garage in there at that time. So what was in that building in your wildest imagination? Well, it was a gambling saloon. And this building wasn't torn down until long ago. But we like to know where things were, and we could keep our eye on them that way. This is the building, of course, which will be built in its stead. The new fire department, police department, county health department, and maintenance yards to the left of that. But the other building will still stand there at this point in time. And this building was torn down to make way for another market square, which is an empty square block of parking lot, until it became the printing plant site for the Lincoln Journal-Star. Actually, it's the Journal-Star Printing Company, which is a separate corporation. Another railroad, which came, was the Union Pacific. And the Union Pacific gave Lincoln a connection from Valley, Nebraska to Beatrice, Nebraska. This particular building and its track were built in 1877. The address for this depot was said to be 4th and O Streets. So today, it would be in the middle of that yard. We also don't think of the Union Pacific as being a passenger train, but at the height of passenger travel, people were not getting on the train to go to Denver or the West Coast. They were getting on the train in Lincoln to go to Rokeby or Roca or Beatrice. So at one point at the height, the Union Pacific said they were putting on and taking off as many as 150 people a day, passengers, at this depot in Lincoln, Nebraska. Seems inconceivable. This little building will be remodeled and spruced up and will look like this. This is taken about 1970. Art Dershner and I went down and took pictures of the building because it was abandoned. The Union Pacific had taken its passenger depot and taken it over to the new depot. And about 1974, this building will be torn down in order to prevent it from being requested by the Lincoln Rail fans. They thought this would make a great museum, but it's kind of in the middle of all those tracks. The legal obstacles would have been insurmountable. The rail fans at that time, and they may have had a different name than the Lincoln rail fans at that time, but they owned a steam locomotive, which they had parked over behind what's now Cook Foods, over on the other side. And they wanted to bring it over here and have a rail museum. So, quick like a bunny, the Union Pacific tore it down and built in its place a Butler building or a Balin building, which still had the word Lincoln on it. Was not a passenger depot, but it was kind of the depot for the city of Lincoln. Not much left of the building at that point in time. This is I think, the picture that was on the postcard that went out. The Granger brothers. Harry Granger came first in 1881. He came from England. He worked for the Hargraves Grocery, Wholesale Grocers in Lincoln, which we'll see in just a second. He started in 1887, however, with a fruit market at 917 O Street, 917Q. And 917Q would be where the Burkholder Project is today. So he had a fruit market there. 1904, this had been the Tremont Hotel. It had had another name before that called the Illinois House on the corner right there. This is the southwest corner of 8th and P Streets. And it had become the Tremont Hotel. And in 1904, the Grangers will buy the Tremont Hotel and convert it to Wholesale Grocery. 1906, they will build the building right next to the West, which is extant and has the beautiful address blocks and stone above it. 1912, they will build the building to the south where the old Metropolitan Hotel stood. By 1912, they will have built one building, which is $110,000. Then in 1952, they became the suppliers to IGA, Independent Grocers Alliance. 1962, they moved to the industrial tract out by the penitentiary on 25 acres of land. 1960s, they became Fleming Foods, so it just kind of cycles out of business. Bill Schlabitz will take this building on the corner, the Tremont Hotel, tear it down, and build a new building on the site, which will be the Salvation Army building, the structure of which is still there, and it is a very compatible building, a very nice building in there, fits nicely, now owned by Speedway Properties, and is leased out to a coffee shop and a yogurt shop, and next door to it in the old banana warehouse is a sushi restaurant. Every third building in the Haymarket sells coffee, I think. By city ordinance, perhaps, I'm not sure. This is the southeast corner of 8th and O Streets. During most of its life, it was the Raymond Brothers and Clark Wholesale Grocery concern. And it is the last large, I would say, undeveloped or unredeveloped building in the Haymarket. It has wooden beam construction, looks ripe for redevelopment. It has one structural flaw inside, which I don't think would be hard to compensate for, but apparently they overloaded one of the floors at one point, and it settled a little bit. But I'm told that that could probably be redone. Raymond Brothers, Isaac, came from Iowa in 1871, and three more brothers joined him in 1872. They were both wholesale and retail grocers on 10th Street between O and P. Then in 1875, they switched completely to wholesale grocery. 1878, Isaac was elected to the office of being the chief of the fire department, which was a volunteer fire department at that time. 1880, George Clark, with an E on the end of his name, joined the firm. And then in 1882, they acquired the building directly across from the Capitol Hotel to the east, which you may remember as the site, well, it's the Grand Hotel, but before that it was Commonwealth. Before that it was Tex Rickard's Pool Hall when I was in the university. Bob, do you remember that Tex Rickard's? Yes, that's we did idle away some of our youth there, perhaps. Not too much, but that's where they had their wholesale grocery for a time. And they became so large at that point in time that they had 12 employees that were on the road at all time, selling wholesale groceries in Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. And they were doing $1 million a year in wholesale groceries. They had grown enough so that they were having to use other buildings that they leased in the area. And in 1885, they built this building then to bring all of their operations into one building. The building has a Seton and Lee cast iron front, and they were very proud of their offices, which I think were on the second floor. It's a little unclear, made of solid cherry wood. And I'm afraid they may be gone. Somebody must have salvaged that cherry wood. We don't know. Have to talk to Sid and see if he got that cherry wood out of there. Isaac was elected to the House of Representatives in the then two-house system in Nebraska's legislature, and later he was elected to the Senate. And at that time, they also became meat packers in the city. 1951, the business was purchased by H.P. Law and Company. H.P. Law had come to Lincoln in 1869 as a confectioner, made candy, and he also sold soda pop, which he manufactured, and also was a beer wholesaler by 1882. 1880s, someplace he started something called the Lincoln Drug Company, which kind of continued on. Then he built the building on the northwest corner of 8th and Q, which, among other things, had the Milady coffee can up on top, part of the water system. In 1953, he consolidated with Archie Furs Wholesale Grocery Company, which was acquired by Nash Finch. And Nash Finch was also the owner in Nebraska of something called Sun Mart. Today, Nash Finch reports that they sell $5 billion worth of groceries wholesale every year, and they call themselves the second largest food wholesaler in the United States. However, that is in contention. 1951, this building, as they moved out west with the merger of the two firms, this became the Merchandise Mart as we see it here. Later it became an annex for Schwartz Paper, which is located directly across the street in another wholesale grocery. Then it became storage, and it is storage today. Kiner, I'm not sure what, Kiner, and it's electrical and plumbing completely. And they're storing things in there, and would make an excellent next building to be considered for redevelopment. A great question is, what is the building directly down the street on the left-hand side? I think it is a cooling tower for the Lincoln Traction Company, which was also generating electricity, and on the right is the Griswold Seed Company's warehouse. Buildings which are still extant, on the left is the Stacy Fruit Company building, then Harper Brothers, then the Veith building are visible here. Veith was a grocery store owned by a man by the name of Louis Veith. The building was built in 1884. He only lasted there until 1890. Harper Brothers was another saddlery in the taller building right there, 808 P Street. They were established in Lincoln in 1884. The four-story building, however, was not built until 1903. They were a wholesale saddlery business. 1912, behind it, they built the building on the alley, which is the horse collar factory, which they owned. Then by the 1950s, they were still in business, making golf club bags, briefcases, billfolds, belts, things like that, and shortly they closed. The Stacy building on the left was built in 1912 as a food wholesalers. By the 1960s, literally all these buildings that we have seen and will see were either leased, rented, or purchased by Russell Stovers. The Stacy building, for example, did nothing but store candy boxes. We also had the building on the right, which is going to become Hardy Furniture, Miller and Payne's Warehouse as a plumbing supply house, and so forth. And the Stooges, our favorite use. The question is this part of Haymarket or not? It's on or not. It's on 9th Street between P and Q on the west side of the street, 227 North 9th. The architect was James Tyler. And Mr. Tyler, of course, the Tyler family was instrumental in building not only the penitentiary, but the old City Hall building, which is the old post office building on 9th and O Streets. And the Tyler House still stands at 8th and D Streets, that great Victorian house down there. This was, among other things, where Norden Laboratories was located in 1919. I remember it as the Underground Restaurant, 1972. It went in there and then became Brittany's in 1983. I have no idea what's in there now. It has been an art gallery and lots of other things through the years. Okay. Russell Stover Candy Company came about, started in 1893 as the Gillen and Bonney Candy Company. In that year, Mr. Gillen, who had been with the Lash Candy Company in Lincoln, joined in 1895 with a man named William Bonney, became Gillen and Bonney Candy Company. This building is built for other purposes originally, but we'll get on with that later on. They had a lot of very popular candy bars which they distributed in a large area. The Lincoln Bar, the Mr. Goodfellow, and the Peanut Shortcake, none of which I remember. By 1900, they had 25 employees. And in 1906, the northern two-thirds of the building burned to the ground. Then in 1918, with World War I, sugar rationing came along. And Mr. Bonney promptly died of the flu epidemic of 1918. Now, at that point in time, we want to slip over to Iowa, to Onawa, Iowa, where there is a druggist by the name of Christian Nelson. And Christian Nelson, he tells the story a little more elaborately perhaps than it actually happened, but it's a good story and we don't want to let it die. Christian tells a story about a young man who came into his drugstore to the soda fountain and wanted to buy an ice cream cone. He had a nickel. He wanted to buy an ice cream cone. Oh, wait a minute. Don't think I want an ice cream cone. I want a candy bar. No, make that an ice cream cone. No, a candy bar. Well, he couldn't make up his mind. What he ultimately bought is lost in history. But Mr. Nelson said, why can't we come up with something so that the kid could buy both at the same time? So he started experimenting. He started taking a piece of ice cream and dipping it in chocolate and discovered that if you do that, it just dissolves and melts right into the chocolate. But he began adding to the chocolate paraffin. And if you add enough paraffin to the chocolate, you can dip the ice cream into it and come out and it's coated with chocolate. Amazing. Well, he sold that idea to a guy in Denver. The guy in Denver's name was Russell Stover. And Russell Stover had already been in business with something called Mrs. Stover's Bungalow Candies. But Russell Stover took this ice cream treat and renamed it the I-Scream Bar. And he then very wisely renamed it again and called it the Eskimo Pie. 1919. In the 1940s, again a war and again sugar rationing. And at that point in time, wanting the sugar ration, Russell Stover's will buy the Gillen Bonnie Candy Company, primarily to get the sugar rationing, but ultimately they will bring virtually all of their production facilities to the city of Lincoln. In 1947, they will invent the Pecan Delight. We sometimes called it the turtle when I was a kid. By 1954, they had over 1,000 employees working in Lincoln. They were making 250,000 pounds of chocolate per week. That's Freeman Everett on the right, who was the foreman of the Lincoln plant. And they've literally, as I said, taken over all the buildings down there. This is the chocolate churning facility, doing God knows what with chocolates. And I would challenge you to look at this picture and not think of Lucille Ball. Okay? Here these ladies are stuffing candy in boxes. In 1980, Russell Stover's just suddenly left Lincoln, taking with them one of the largest employers in the city of Lincoln. Of course, most of those people were underemployed or part-time employed, but one of the largest employers in the city of Lincoln. So in 1980, we then have the empty area which we were going to redevelop as the Haymarket. Another railroad which came to town was the Missouri Pacific Railroad, which crossed Nebraska in 1880, but they avoided Lincoln. They said there would never be enough freight generated in Lincoln for them to bother coming here. So finally, they're going to build this building in conjunction with Chicago Northwestern. They will share the building at approximately 8th or 9th and S Streets. The building is remodeled in 1953. Well, this will be the new building, which replaces it. A building which I should remember, but I don't. It was remodeled in 1953 so that in 1958 they could tear it down. And of course, it became the site of the present post office and parking facilities to the west. One of the things that this railroad did not have going for it was that ordinarily when a train comes in, it would pull along beside the depot, take people off, and then continuing on. But this was set up over on S Street. They came in from the northeast and then had to back out and get on the track to go out of Lincoln. So people like to joke that they didn't have a through train through Lincoln. So feeling that that was not fair, July the 21st of 1911, one of the engineers ran a train right through the back of the building, right into the, and what had happened was he had started leaving with an engine very early in the morning from their yard to bring it up to the depot, and as it made that curve, swinging around towards the south, he fell off the train. And the train, of course, then nobody was there, and it kept going right through the back of the train. So suddenly, Lincoln does have Missouri Pacific tracks, which are through tracks. This could have been in Kansas City at the Plaza, but it isn't. It's when they tear the building down. And the last buildings to go were the freight buildings, which are directly to the north, and they went down probably a couple of decades ago. So this is a general idea. My wife always says, don't tell so much about the railroads when you tell the Haymarket area story. But the railroads are the story of the Haymarket. If the railroads had not come, Haymarket would not have developed. I don't know whether we have any time for questions, but with the tape, but we will open the floor for questions now. And if not, I thank you for coming, and I will stick around for a time as the tape winds down, and then if you have any questions that you're ashamed to ask in front of anybody else, why, I'll be glad to try and answer them for you. Thank you very much.